Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Living Legacies, Torbreck Revisited. Thank you for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. The enthusiasm around this event really speaks to the significance of Torbreck, how well it was designed, how well it's been loved, and its lasting legacy.
We're really excited to be partnering with Brisbane Open House tonight for this event. Brisbane Open House has been going for 15 years now, hosting many events and tours around Brisbane. This weekend they have an exciting lineup of events, walks and tours, so check out their program if you haven't already.
I'm Sarah and this is Lydia. We're part of the EmAGN Queensland committee, which is a group within the Australian Institute of Architects supporting emerging and early career architects. Thank you. We run a range of events throughout the year, from talks like this one to tours and workshops, so keep an eye out if you'd like to come along to more things like this.
We're gathered here today on the land of the Kurupa. We'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as traditional custodians of these lands and pay our respect to elders past and present. We recognise their ongoing connection to the land, waters and culture. A huge thank you to Brisbane Open House for working with us on this event, and our sponsor Leah for supporting the work of EmAGN Queensland and help making events like this possible.
Tonight's talk will focus on the much revered Torbreck apartments, Highgate Hill, completed in 1960 by architects Aubrey and Robert Froud. Torbreck was Brisbane's first high-rise residential tower and a bold departure from traditional housing typologies. Today, Australian cities are being called to rethink what home means. The dream of a freestanding home is giving way to a future that is smaller, denser and more flexible, and often with shared amenity. Torbreck offers lessons in all of these areas.
So tonight we welcome Susan Holden, Leah Gallagher and Aaron Peters to share their perspectives on Torbreck's story, covering its history, heritage, adaptation and what these ideas mean for contemporary practice. Each speaker will present and then we'll open the floor to a Q&A. While they're speaking, please consider any questions you'd like to ask at the end of the 3 talks.
Our first speaker is Susan Holden. Susan is an architect and senior lecturer at the University of Queensland and a member of the ATCH research group. She's lived in Torbreck for nearly 20 years, making it both a home and a research subject. Her apartment has featured in the ABC documentary Streets of Your Town, and she has guided numerous tours for Brisbane Open House. Her research explores the value of architecture. Through Torbreck, she examines heritage, housing and sustainability. Please welcome Susan.
Thanks, Sarah and Lydia. Thank you for the invitation to talk about Torbreck, which is one of my favourite topics. And thank you, Brisbane Open House, for partnering with EmAGN for this event. I volunteered for the first Brisbane Open House, I think, in 2010. You can correct me if I've got that date wrong. Just down the road in the Thomas Dixon Centre. So I've had a long-standing relationship with Brisbane Open House and it's a fabulous event, so I'd encourage you to take advantage of that this weekend. And I will talk a little bit about the way that I've opened up my apartment to through Brisbane Open House and other public kind of avenues in this talk tonight as well. As the introduction said, I'm an academic at the University of Queensland. I'm also an architect and a long-term resident of Torbreck. I moved in 2003 and lived there until very recently. So my talk tonight weaves together these different perspectives that I have on the experience of living in the building and thinking about and researching Torbreck. And the themes that I guess we've all been invited to reflect on tonight, including things like the housing crisis, how we might live more sustainably, this idea of adaptation and longevity and authorship, and how we might define the values of architecture are themes I explore in various ways in my research and my teaching. So I welcome the opportunity to think about these themes through Torbreck. And in particular tonight, I'm going to talk about Torbreck's adaptability through its occupation, both at a building scale and an apartment scale, and what are the lessons we might learn from this for understanding what higher density forms of housing need to be. And because I'm an academic, I've got lots of notes here, so bear with me. I'll try not to go on too long, and I'll try not to read too much. But I do want to start with a little bit of history, and also this question of density. So density is often presented as an obvious answer to the housing crisis, and we can perhaps kind of reflect and argue about whether density is more a measure of something or more a control, and we can perhaps also reflect and argue about whether density is the answer. Many would argue that actually to solve the housing crisis, policy is the answer. But putting all of that aside, density is also this thing that Brisbane in its history thinks it hasn't done very well. And I think this is both true and false. So I think we tend to have amnesia about models of both high and medium density housing that have accompanied the urbanisation of Brisbane. And Torbreck, I guess, is one of these models that we can consider and maybe part of what we might do tonight. But it's not the only one. And there's lots of medium and high density examples, historical examples that I think we should return to and are worthy of our scrutiny. But yeah, let's start with a bit of history. So Torbreck was constructed in the second half of the 20th century as Brisbane was transforming into what we think of now as a sprawling city. Even in 1957, when the project was first marketed, the Premier of Queensland, Nicklin, supported the scheme as an example of high-density inner urban development that would be an important way for Brisbane to curb its urban sprawl. So this idea of high-density housing as a way to curb sprawl was really there from the very beginning for Torbreck. And this image on the screen at the moment is an image from one of the marketing brochures made to publicise the building. You can see that dominant low-density form of housing in the inner city. But if you look a bit more closely, you can also see lots of missing things from our current image of the city, including things like the Southeast Freeway, which hadn't yet arrived and which really entrenched a kind of car dependence in the fabric of the city. The post-war decades also saw an acceleration of mass housing construction that was influenced by modernist design, émigré architects, new building technologies, and entrepreneurial models of property development. And Torbreck really encapsulates all these factors, which is one of the things I think that makes it so significant historically, but also so interesting to reflect on from our present position. It was constructed between 1958 and 1960 and was one of the first architecturally significant high-rise residential projects completed in Australia. Torbreck was designed by architects Aubrey H. Job and Robert P. Froud, and it was constructed by the Kratzmann Construction Company. The high-rise apartment building is really a key typology of modernism, but the individual buildings and the buildings that came out of the kind of ideas and often utopian ideas of modernism also have complex and contradictory histories. And I think the lessons that we can learn from high-rise housing are to be found in the ways that particular buildings have adapted to local conditions and climates and to particular models of ownership and governance as much as they are lessons in design. Torbreck's design, for those of you who don't know, I'm conscious that I'm speaking to a lot of people who know the building really well and probably know this history quite well as well. But it's always nice to kind of remember these things about the building. So its design combines the modernist tower, which you can see in the background of this image, and what was called the slab, which is a way to describe the garden block part of Torbreck. And these two modernist forms of housing design were pioneered by the Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier. But the project also incorporated quite interesting landscape influences from other parts of the world, including California and South America. In Torbreck's design, these two modernist forms are arranged to take advantage of the sloping site to maximise amenity and aspect for individual units. So that's quite an interesting site-specific adaptation of those modernist ideas. And Torbreck is also very well known for its use of reinforced concrete lift slab construction, and it was the first time this technique was used in Queensland. And it was also, the building was also built at a time when the concrete industry was really rapidly expanding in Queensland, and that's another really interesting part of its history that's maybe less explored in the current the way that we kind of mythologise Torbreck, perhaps. The building was listed on the Queensland Heritage Register in 1999, and the citation recognises the historical significance of these kind of key aspects of the building that I've just described. But understanding Torbreck as a model of housing is also really bound up, I think, in its development model and its titling arrangement, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about that now. So Torbreck was initiated as a speculative home units development, and in this respect it was quite different from earlier entrepreneurial models of flat development in Brisbane, where the return on investment was really about a rental income for a single owner. The development company Reed Murray was both the financier and the contractor, and a key part of the development model was to pre-sell apartments off the plan. The early sales success of this enterprise inspired plans for other towers, which used the Torbreck name at Burleigh Heads and Surfers Paradise, which you can see in this poster. But at the time that this development was being proposed, there was no building ordinances in Queensland or in Brisbane that provided for home units. So strata title had not yet been introduced and did not get widely adopted across the country until later in the 1960s. And Torbreck was thus Queensland's first company title multi-storey residential building and remains under company title. This is sometimes seen as a limitation, but I think it's interesting that some of the discussion around solving the housing crisis is now exploring the role of different ownership models and titling arrangements and the roles these might play. As a speculative development, Torbreck was extensively marketed, and you can see that happening in this fantastic image of the model for the building on a float. I think this was happening in the Warana tradition that we used to have in Brisbane. And there was a lot of marketing material produced to advertise and spruik the building. It talked about all the kind of modern conveniences and amenities that the apartments integrated, including things like television, modern plumbing, gas drying cupboards, garbage disposal, those kinds of things. And you can see those things highlighted in this imagery of the apartments from the original marketing material, and how it's described and highlighted in the text as well. Other marketing material emphasised the titling arrangement, and this I think was partly about reassuring buyers that the share certificates that they would receive upon parting with their money represented full, complete and unencumbered title to their units, and that the company's articles of association would be a mechanism that owners could use to manage and protect their investment. So in this conception, design and marketing of Torbreck, there was really a powerful alignment of strategies that presented this form of home ownership and units as a secure and desirable model, and I think one that could compete or rival the Australian dream. The architectural vision was equally gracious. We see this word gracious used and repeated in a lot of the marketing material. And it depicted a lot of the common spaces within the building, including a ground floor terrace area and a restaurant, a rooftop lounge, a swimming pool set in expansive gardens. And there was even descriptions of things like basement laundries and that you could get meals delivered from the restaurant directly to your door and things like that. And in these slides you can see some of the influence of the Californian and Brazilian landscape design traditions influencing what was happening in Torbreck's landscapes. The other really interesting part of the design was the linking level, which was the ground floor of the tower building that connected with the rooftop of the garden block. And this was designed to be a street of amenities for residents. And if you've got good eyesight, you can see some of the room labels that show what those amenities were, including a hairdresser and a chemist shop, restaurant, etc. This was directly related to Le Corbusier's Streets in the Sky idea. And this was one part of the building that wasn't actually ever realised, and this was due in part to the financial collapse of the Reed Murray Development Company, but also the constraints of zoning connected with the Brisbane City Council, which I think was really to do with this being a kind of pioneering type of development for which there was no real kind of zoning structure that could cope with it. Torbreck marketed itself to a diverse cohort of buyers. It described the security and privacy of units that might appeal to single people alongside high-quality common facilities that would appeal to families, such as the swimming pool and a children's playground. This is some of the images of Le Corbusier's very famous Unité de Habitation in Marseille, which has this streets in the sky idea. And you can see the streets in the sky there in the section connecting the ground floor of the tower block and the roof of the garden block. I'll just stay on that for a sec. So one of the brochures that marketed the building, just to reiterate this point about appealing to a wide cohort of buyers, described this communal life that you could have in the building, but that it could really end at your front door if you desired. So it says, communal life need only extend to your front door, an ideal situation for ladies living without menfolk and those seeking security and pleasant companionship while retaining perfect privacy. So you get the idea. And this idea that different models of housing should be matched to different demographic groups was really a topical part of discussion about urban growth in Australia after World War II. And Torbreck shows that, I think, really interestingly, that the introduction of high-rise residential buildings as a densification strategy was presented both as a solution that would free up existing housing stock for families out in the suburbs, which is the kind of dominant narrative, but also that the high-rise building itself could be a model that could be suitable for family living. I'm now going to show some depictions of Torbreck in the media that date from when it was first built up to the present. And I think it's really interesting to see how assumptions about who lives in high-rise apartment buildings has changed over time, and this is revealed in some of this media coverage. So in the Courier Mail at the time that the building was first built, this is Grace Garlick, who many of you would know is a really iconic writer for the Courier Mail. This was in the 1960s, so this is from 1963 when the building is first being moved into, and the article is titled At Home in the Clouds, and you can see that, you can read it for yourselves, but she's really painting a picture of this quite glamorous lifestyle, I think. But at the end, it's also talking about the people who are living in the building, which is Mr. and Mrs. Carlos and their 3 teenage daughters, and that they call this home. So this, I think, is really evidencing how right from the beginning children and teenagers were living in Torbreck. And then there's a whole sequence here, one from each decade. So this is from from early on, when this kind of novelty of living in the sky is becomes part of the mythology of Torbreck. This is about 2 women residents tending their balcony gardens, and how it's much easier than mowing the lawn and having a big garden out in the suburbs. This is one of my all-time favourites, is Wayne Kratzmann's penthouse apartment from 1973, Australian Women's Weekly, depicting a glamorous, if overzealous, bachelor pad on the 13th floor. These are from 1993 from the Sunday Mail, talking about some residents in Torbreck, Steve Cotterill and architect Fred Yetzi. And the thing that's interesting about this for me is that it explains how Torbreck had accommodation for singles and couples, and curiously describes them as the forgotten race in residential accommodation, which has maybe changed a little bit in the present. This is from 2006 with the Brisbane News, talking about the maturing apartment market in Brisbane, which only talks about couples living in apartments, and I'm one of those couples depicted, a new resident of Torbreck. And this is from 2012, the Courier Mail ran a story of families in the sky. So this is when we start to get this narrative of what's it like for families to live in a high-rise apartment. And this features architect residents of Torbreck, Shem and Sarah, and their daughter Sophie. And it seemed the content of the article really describes how families are choosing apartments regardless of whether they're being designed or built for them. And reiterates all these benefits of apartment living that were actually promoted right in that early marketing material for Torbreck. And as Sarah and Lydia said in the introduction, that in 2015 Torbreck also featured in the ABC documentary Streets of Your Town. That was presented by Tim Ross and directed by Sally Aitken. Torbreck was the culminating stop in Tim's journey across Australia in search of good housing design, and he ends the 2-part series on the balcony of Torbreck, asking what lessons can we learn from mid-century modernism in terms of modesty, democracy and sustainability. So these questions that we're asking tonight are starting to come onto the agenda. Tim visited my apartment as part of the series. Here he is knocking on my front door. Coming inside, I was, at the time of the filming, I think I was about 8 months pregnant with Florence, who's sitting in the second row tonight. And by the end of 2 days of filming, which made about 15 seconds of footage somehow, most of the crew decided that they also wanted to live in Torbreck and thought it was fantastic. So these stories of occupancy have always interested me, even as I've become part of them. And in 2007, Torbreck was a building that was featured as part of the Hot Modernism exhibition at the State Library of Queensland. And this presented an opportunity to explore this further through some oral history stories, in particular of Elsie and Heather, who were both occupants of the building. So for this exhibition, I worked with Deborah Vanderplaat, Gavin Bannerman from the State Library of Queensland, and filmmaker Dean Saffron to record an oral history of long-term occupant of Torbreck, Heather Lee, that featured in the Hot Modernism exhibition. And in the process of developing that oral history, along with Deborah and others, we developed this idea of long occupancy evaluation. And the idea with this is to combine the method of oral history, which is common in historical research, and post-occupancy evaluation, which is common in architectural research, to understand apartments as homes rather than transient forms of housing. And one of the things that emerged from this research was the centrality of social spaces within Torbreck and the role they played in the long occupancy for residents. I'm just going to skip this so I can speed up a bit. And now what I'm going to do, if you'll indulge me a little bit, is to talk a little bit more personally about my experience of living in the building. So Torbreck's social spaces are a key part of the original vision for the development, although not all of them were realised in the way that they were originally designed or intended. But they are also really dynamic settings, and I think a long-term perspective on the value of these spaces is one of the lessons that Torbreck offers. And one of the ways that we can, and has ongoing relevance for the way that we might understand the dynamics of housing density, which is such a crucial topic for us today. The backyard is one of Torbreck's most significant assets and social spaces. It's the open ground plane was one of the key points of Le Corbusier's modernism, but really the scale and accessibility and common ownership of the ground plane in Torbreck is really expansive and rare, I think, even by Le Corbusier's standards. Greg Bamford, an ex-colleague of mine, has analysed how backyards are a key space in the domestic economy, and I think the same principle can be applied at Torbreck. The backyard is the epitome of an unprogrammed space. It provides space for kids to climb trees, for nature play, for impromptu dinners with neighbours, for baby showers and book clubs, a place to dry a tent after a rainy camping trip, a space to meet your local member, to compost, to garden, to have pets, a space for large groups to socialise, and a space to mark important milestones. But it's not the only important social space in Torbreck. In 2017, the chemist shop, as it's fondly known as, which is at the entrance of the building, was acquired by the company after some tense and protracted negotiations that were almost derailed by the ambiguity of its zoning under the city plan, Brisbane City Plan, which is really a kind of legacy from its original construction. And I think this is a good example of how the governance of the building worked to improve the building and the experience of living in the building for all residents. And I imagine and hope that this is going to be the case in an ongoing way as Torbreck continues to adapt for lots of different kinds of things like electric vehicles and different forms of power and different forms of postal service and all these kinds of things that just continuously change. So while it was being negotiated what the chemist shop should be used for, residents were able to make use of this space for temporary events, including art shows, movie nights and community gatherings, and these are just some photos of those kinds of things. So these images show residents celebrating the 60th anniversary of Torbreck together at a gathering that included a kids' art show and performances. There's some fantastic drawings by some of the younger residents of the buildings. And another event we hosted in this space over the summer of 2019 was the Torbreck cardboard construction project. And if any of you know Olafur Eliasson, you'll know that reference. And this was really to occupy kids over the summer. The space is now the Torbreck office, and Leah maybe will talk about that a little bit, I'm not sure. And the window, the iconic kind of curved window, which is not really very curved, has become an iconic display area for that the talented Kate often decorates for particular events throughout the year. And here is Kate hosting a Christmas decoration workshop with some of the kids. The other part of Torbreck's adaptability is in its apartments themselves, and for me this is how this adaptability, or my appreciation of this adaptability, is really felt through how my particular apartment has been adapted as my life has changed and my needs have changed over the 20 years that I've lived in the building with my family, including and most significantly through the addition of 2 children to my family. So as a family of 4, we've made intensive use of every square millimetre of our 85 square metre apartment. But most of our needs have been answered quite simply by changing furniture arrangements or through temporary adaptations. And these are just some images of that. Lots of cubbies going on. And I think this is a reflection of the fundamentally good bones of the building, its efficient layout, its relatively generous room dimensions, its practical functional relationships in the plan, its inclusion of utility spaces and built-in storage, and consideration for light and ventilation. But it also requires things of us. It requires us not to hoard stuff, and it requires us to be quite disciplined about the way we keep things and pass them on when we don't need them anymore. The balconies are a really invaluable extension to our living spaces and get used for all kinds of things. And these last few images of me living in my apartment with my family are from COVID, and it's interesting to look back on these kinds of images now, because I think it really did inspire some creative disruption to the way spaces get used, which children have a particular talent for. So here's, on the right-hand side is Florence, who just started prep and was learning to read, doing sight word practice with my partner Ian, and interspersing each word with a lap around the living room on her bicycle. Bit of reading in the bathtub. The most challenging adaptation we've done to our apartment was when our children, as our children have grown up and really wanted more of their own private space. And I think that need for privacy is not to be underestimated in apartment living, as the original marketing material stated very astutely. And in how to solve this problem, we were inspired by another family who lived in Torbreck, who had slightly older kids who would always have a little bit of sage advice just as we needed it at a moment of crisis that we were about to face. And this is what Shem, Sarah and Sophie and Ruby did in their apartment, which was to divide one of their 2 bedrooms into 2 smaller private spaces. So I took inspiration from this and was doing this very same thing a year later in my apartment. We did this in a less permanent way, just using pegboards and bookshelves and bits of furniture to demarcate territory. But I think this extended the time that we could comfortably live in our apartment by about 2 years. Where are we up to? Here's a few more of these. So, yeah, but we did get to the point where we did need more space. So in 2024, we realised that we would all really benefit from more private space, and we decided to experiment with 3-bedroom living, and we're doing that not far from Torbreck at the moment. Despite the 2021 census data showing that between 1 in 20 and 1 in 5 families living in apartments in Australia, research also shows that there's a serious drought of 3-bedroom apartments, and that's really what we're feeling right now. Even Torbreck only has a handful of these. And so it's clear to me that the diverse occupancy that Torbreck really envisaged hasn't really become the norm. So while we pursue our experiment in 3-bedroom living, we have had a chance to attend to some much needed maintenance of our Torbreck apartment. And this is some final images before I hand over to Leah of what we've done with our apartment. There's always a temptation as an architect to overthink the solution and the design, but we've chosen a very minimal intervention approach to do as much as necessary and as little as possible. And this is also good heritage practice and respects the original fabric of our apartment, even though only the exterior of the building is protected by heritage legislation. It respects the good bones of the apartment's original design and construction, and it also recognises, I think, that life is transient and can be lived with less than we think we need. And I see this every day in the building, more broadly, in the renovation of the foyers, in the garden block balconies, in the countless ways that the building is cared for and carefully maintained on a daily basis. I'm conscious that there's countless renovation stories in Torbreck, and many of you sitting in the audience probably have a renovation story, which are, across the spectrum of transformative and less transformative and interventionist. But this one, our little renovation, is just one of these, and it's a very modest one. So these final slides just show a little bit of the work that we've done in our apartment, including things like the localised repair of the joinery in the kitchen that where some material substitutions had happened, and with poor materials. Adding things that can be taken away later if we decide. Regrouting the original tiles, repainting and resealing the original joinery. We reluctantly replaced the rusted through basin in the bathroom, but kept the joinery intact, and also did regrouting of tiles and repainting in these spaces. We removed the original gas drying cupboard, which on balance we decided would yield precious additional storage space and that was worthwhile. But we just filled the cavity with a very simple cupboard. Otherwise, really what we've done is to repaint, reseal joinery, keeping things like the retractable clothesline that still works, even after more than 60 years. Probably the biggest job that we've done is restoring and rust-proofing the steel frame sliding doors and hopper window sets. And we've decided to keep those as a crucial part of the original fabric of the building, whereas I know there's lots of other people in the building have replaced them with aluminium frame windows and doors just because of the ease of use and maintenance. So there is a kind of dilemma there, but we've gone down the road of restoring the original fabric. So I think where this brings me to is really thinking about the value of longevity of buildings, and I think this idea of maintenance practices and keeping things is becoming more mainstream in architecture. But we still have some way to go in how we describe and value this kind of work as design and as a design kind of practice. And I think this bears on the question of adaptability and authorship that the EmAGN crew have invited us to think about tonight. And now I'm going to pass you across to some architects who actually do architecture things in the building to talk more about that. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up. That was really lovely, thank you. And that's such a nice intro into what the building is, and I sort of hoped that you were going to go there, so I didn't really need to fully go there myself. My name's Leah Gallagher, I'm from Kin Architects. And just a bit about us, that's not actually us, but that's what we sort of hope to be, which is kind of like this one sort of big family with close relationships with our clients, consultants, builders, and everyone else in the office as well. And we've got Ash here this afternoon, or this evening. So we do a lot of work that's with Queenslander houses, which is pretty similar to Aaron. In their pristine condition, they look like this. And often when we find them, they kind of have had a lot of strange things happen to them. They're a little bit kind of Frankenstein. There's many edits. Some of them are good and worth keeping, and some of them actually need to be removed to give some clarity to what's going on. And a lot of the times when people come to us, they've got a house and it's not grounded and connected to the garden. It doesn't ventilate well. It doesn't get great natural light. The bathrooms and kitchens need to be modernised, and the living areas need to be more generous. So those kind of briefs are pretty typical, and that's what our experience had been until we'd worked in Torbreck, and then we sort of started doing more apartments. So I'm going to talk about the Torbreck apartments that we've done. I'm actually not talking about the foyer. More apartments after that, and then some future ideas that I'm just going to touch on quickly. So Torbreck 1.0 for us was in 2018, and it came from a cabinet maker who I'd worked with for sort of 7 years previously when I worked with Kieran Gate Architects. And this was the first thing that William McMahon and I had worked on, and it was a bathroom renovation to a 1920s Queenslander. And the client was super gun-ho, like he had the demo crew there the same day the architects were starting, so it was like quite a scary experience. And he was sort of, we cut the VJ lining back and exposed the stud framing because it was water damage. We left the paint colours that the bathroom had been over time underneath the skylight. And then when William got involved, the design idea at that point, like I always like speculating or thinking about what would have been there. So, it's a 1920s Queenslander. There would have been some kind of furniture-style wash basin, and there was probably a round mirror above it. And that kind of was the start of the thinking. And then working with William, he loves making things harder for himself, which is very rare for a tradesperson. But I did the shop drawings for the steel for him, and we sort of were bolting it to the frame, and he was encouraging me to make things even more complicated than what they already were. And that little chute thing, that's the laundry chute, the idea was that it was kind of like a periscope for the kids, and I was willing to just turf it, and William's like, no, I'll go find ducting. And then we did this ensuite in the same project, and it was this real sort of delicate incision into the existing space, and it was thinking about the heritage of the space and what that modern idea would be. So the clients in Torbreck, so that's Matt and Steph, our clients on the left. That's William on the right, and William probably met Matt and Steph and remembered our previous trauma of people half demolishing things and then deciding to have a design, or that they needed a design. And he was like, I know who can help you. Leah can help you. So when I arrived, we'd just started our practice, and it was exciting for me. I was very familiar with Torbreck and excited about the prospect of doing something in the building. And so I turned up and was, great, cool, Torbreck, excited to see what we're dealing with. And then I went upstairs and I was like, and, you're trying to like keep calm in front of your new prospective first clients. And they had started demolition and started kind of building a new plinth at the same time, and they're professionals and they're very handy, and I didn't want to undo anything that they'd already started doing, so it's kind of like I told them it's a bit like a renovation within a renovation. And for me, I began in the usual places of just looking into what was there, reading about the promotional material, and hearing everything was about the view and the flexibility and the communal space, all this like lovely stuff that's just sort of rabbit holes of fun to read about. And so for me, the compelling thing was the view. You definitely felt like you were up in the clouds in the apartment, but for the client, it was really a different view, and it was more about how we're going to watch movies in this super like well-lit space. And also I want to meal prep and watch Game of Thrones, like that's my dream routine. How are we going to do that? And this is the first sketch that was just in my notebook because we were meeting clients kind of in the cafe at the time. And Aaron's told me the pointer's not that good on this, but maybe I'll just point. But the island is sort of the thing in the centre with the arrow coming off it. And it's sort of sitting on a timber plinth, and I guess the idea was that if we had an island that had the kitchen, most of the kitchen in the island, it would mean that you're kind of like out here looking at the view when you're prepping, rather than having your back turned to everyone and the view. So the idea straight away was, connecting to the view, but then also the TV could kind of pop out from the wall and you could watch Game of Thrones while you're getting all your meals ready. And then, so that was the original plan for the apartment, but the clients didn't really inherit that. They inherited this, which was like a 1990s reno that had lots of Carrara marble everywhere. And the living space, you can kind of see, maybe I will use the mouse. The living space is here, but it's kind of this strange T shape. And they'd moved the kitchen into the alcove. So what the clients decided to do was make the living area a better size by partially removing that bedroom. So they gave themselves a small walk-in robe and then decided to make this sort of larger, more square-shaped living space. And then when we became involved, they'd sort of built this plinth here. And our idea was really to use the plinth to run the services to the kitchen and kind of create this big snaking wall system of storage along here. And then what this did was it sort of gave them a lot of zones. So they had, the dining room really does feel like its own distinct little room with its own servery. And then the brief was definitely for a wine bar. So they kind of had this wine bar end that was near the balcony and the view. Then there's the working kitchen, the lounge room, a sitting reading room, and then there's the other bedroom became a guest room, music room, home office. They've got like a Murphy bed that comes out and guitars and everything. So you do really need to use every square metre in an apartment to make it useful and livable for the people. You know, like if you want to go play loud music or do something noisy, you can kind of head off over here. The other, I guess at the same time, we're talking about the look and feel of the apartment, and the easiest reference point for everyone was the Jetsons, and that it could be this kind of like exciting, mod, graphic, whimsical kind of thing. And this is the first image that we showed them, where we've got the island with the wine bar at the end, kind of, and it's more open, and then this sort of material that wrapped around all the walls. And this is the image that I showed them at the time that said, basically what I was trying to say, if you paint everything a similar colour, it's going to make it feel bigger. And if you put white fixtures on it, it's going to pop and give you that kind of scientific lab type feel that we were sort of hopeful in going for. I wanted to bring some colour into the project and help ground it, so we went with like a dark blue carpet. I always loved Torbreck colours, sort of tans and blues, and that was the kind of colour scheme that we went with. William, the cabinet maker, loves to make everything more difficult for himself, so instead of cutting the bench top in a straight line, he got me to do the shop drawings where the half rounds we used on the cabinet work could be water jet cut through the marble. And we did recycle a lot in this project. All of the existing appliances were pretty much recycled except for two. The timber was recycled, the marble. The reason why we could do such a high level of finish is because the client spent their whole weekends kind of building it in the cabinet maker's workshop and priming all the panels and everything. They lived in it while it was all being constructed, and so we'd have site meetings kind of amongst everything. And then this is the finished outcome with the paneling that kind of hides all the storage, and they have these amazing like dog-sized cats. And the fun thing about it, I think, is that the height of the wine bar, and you know, this particular photo shows it well, and being up a bit higher seated in the dining room gives this really nice eye height sort of connection. And breaking the island down does make it sort of less dominating and a bit more sort of table-like. That's the dining room with its own servery and William's kind of cut stone detail. And then the storage, like having that one uniform material to hide the aircon, all the TV bits and pieces, the TV itself, and then you can kind of pull that out when you want to have movie nights. And then having a reading end is very valuable to them. This is my favourite image and part of the whole project is that always thinking about apartments like houses, I think it does open up some opportunities sometimes. So just talking to the clients about this would be a great place. If this is a house, you put a skylight here, so let's just put something reflective on the ceiling. And the client, Steph, said at the time she thought it was stupid. And then now she says one of her favourite parts of the apartment. The vanity, so the clients had really, when we started, they purchased the tiles, they purchased everything. And so we were just sort of making a vanity out of the recycled materials and inserting it in. They had these massive cats that they had to wash, so we sort of did an arch out of the mirror so that you could swing the tap back. And at the same time, we did arches out of the shower screen so that you could open them up and put clothes dryers there or kitty litter or whatever it is. And then that's the end result. And then other apartments. So this kind of like typecast us, like Hugh Grant in rom-coms, and all of a sudden people were contacting us about apartments. So we did a wool store apartment where we turned it into a family home and kind of removed the like bulky structure to reveal the heritage structure, which was quite fun. We did a Beaumont apartment that was for like a home chef, but on a very kind of tight budget. A Glenfalloch apartment that was a sanctuary for one person, and she told us when we were on site that we weren't doing any white walls, so that took some thinking on the spot. And then Torbreck 2.0 for us, because we'd sort of done this like training ground of understanding apartments. So 2.0 was mostly about us understanding our client and what she likes. And this is Jenny, she's passionate about the environment, loves sailing, as a science educator. So she's kind of had this whole other interest, but different from Matt and Steph, like she travels overseas for work all the time. She's not going to be on the tools, and there was a very definite budget with what we were doing. So we began in the same place, thinking about what the apartment was. We knew that with the budget, we weren't going to be changing any of the plumbing points, so we needed to kind of be pragmatic with what we were doing straight away. The apartment faces southwest, so it doesn't get the best natural light throughout the day. So we did the familiar move of rearranging everything so that it could look out to the view. And then in the kitchen, you know, just thinking, wouldn't it be a great spot for a kitchen window? So let's put a mirror there. And then when you're working in the kitchen, you do get that bigger view bouncing back, which is great. And for the client, the materials were more about like her wanting these sort of like organic things, but she did really love that deep blue colour. And those tiles on the splashback are actually recycled computer hardware melted down, which she just like loved. And then the finishes, she didn't want like a blingy box, so we're kind of trying to use some reflective materials to bounce light, but not too much. The bedrooms was like white. You know, there was sort of like 1990s cabinetry that was all decaying, and just replaced it with white stuff and allowed Torbreck to kind of be the hero of the room. And then the bathrooms, there were existing mosaics we wanted to keep, found a wall tile that matched it, and then just sort of went from there and you know, put in a nice light fitting that told the client it felt like a jellyfish. Makes sense, right? And she was happy with that. Then future apartments of Brisbane. So this is just an additional idea about sort of addressing the topic of tonight. It's about housing density. And I think what I've learnt from doing all of these apartments is it's really hard to renovate apartments. Like the work hours are limited. It's hard to get waste out. It's hard to get deliveries in. It's hard to manage the lifts. There's a lot of neighbours. There's body corporates. There's like a lot to navigate. And when we do these careful little apartment refurbs, I often think about like, God, it'd be so much easier if we were just doing the whole building, and it'd be cheaper as well. So this is just an example that I saw on a study tour that I just thought this sort of type I haven't really seen, definitely not in Brisbane, not in Australia, but this is in Berlin, and it's a 4-storey townhouse development with a shared courtyard with an apartment development behind it. This image will show you that, so each townhouse is vertical, but they each have a front door onto the street, and that's actually where the home office is. So you could run your own business from there quite easily. This is a little bit dry, but there's not many images of this project. So it's a ZE05 project by, I think, architect Xander Cohen. I think I'm probably pronouncing everything wrong, but that's what it is. That's the street where the office is. What's interesting about this is that there's a basement car park and you park outside of your laundry door. So when you come in, you walk through your laundry and can sort of dump things through, come upstairs, and there's a sort of generous volume that has a kitchen and living space that opens onto a courtyard that's built on top of the car park. And then this is sort of more higher density apartments behind. And so this is that courtyard space that's on top of the basement car park, and there's sort of these deep reveals into the kitchen. So when you're moving through it, you don't really need to look in, or it's a bit sort of private. And then that's the kitchen space. It's that higher space. And then, so that kind of, you could see straight away how families could live here and how it could be quite successful. In Australia, I guess the other thing to talk about is we do have this Nightingale model that's been around for, I think, over 10 years now. And if you haven't heard about it and you're interested in sort of like different procurement methods, like it's definitely worth looking into. So the Nightingale idea is that you can reduce the cost of apartments if you do away with basement car parking. You don't need to have a display suite. You can build up a wait list and sell apartments sort of to a wait list and not need to do so much marketing. The apartments themselves are quite raw and stripped back, and they have each firm that works on them has their own sort of like principles of sustainability that they're going to adhere to. This one in particular is a new Nightingale project that's in Brunswick, which is very, central to the Melbourne CBD. And this apartment entry-level price, it's means tested, sells for $280,000. And it's a loft apartment, and it's got its own terrace, front door entrance, and it just seems like such a great way to be able to get into the housing market and have housing security. And I think Brisbane does need to explore more of these different models. This is also in Melbourne by the same firm, Breathe, and this is a renovate to rent scheme by the developer where they've purchased a mid-century building and done really a light renovation to it, because the best thing we can do is, from a sustainability point of view, is just reuse and improve what we've got rather than knocking it over. What I like about it is that the kitchen cabinetry, you can see that there's existing things that they've kind of worked with instead of ripping out and replacing. And same with the bathrooms, that they've just sort of done a light renovation to what's there. And I often think about, six packs that we've got in Brisbane and how they could be a great starting point to actually renovate the whole thing, but then to increase the density with, is it timber structures on top of them, or is it the ground level car parks could become studio apartments or outdoor rooms, or could we do something to sort of increase the density of them more? And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm Aaron Peters. I'm responsible for you not being able to hear at the back. I did assure everyone that the speaker would be powerful enough, so apologies for that. We can never quite factor in the rain on the roof here, which is a real menace. I'm also going to begin with a short history lesson. Although, unlike Susan, I'm not an academic, and I'm conscious that we live in a post-truth landscape, so I'm just going to lean into that. The account, or what you might call potted history of modernism that I'm about to give you, is completely unverified, and it's also my personal take on the movement. What I don't have is the clicker. Yeah. So, the modernist movement emerged in Europe around the end of the 19th century. It started picking up steam in the early part of the 20th century before conflict in Europe precipitated an exodus of artists, architects and many other creative practitioners. And many of those travelled to North America, including people like Mies van der Rohe, Marcel Breuer and Walter Gropius. But they also moved to Australia. And one of the most prominent emigres to reach Australia was the Austrian-born Harry Seidler, who emigrated to Sydney in 1948, having worked for Marcel Breuer and Oscar Niemeyer. And he was tempted to come out in order to build this building, which is the Rose Seidler House, which was completed in 1950. So Seidler and others fed an already prosperous local modern movement, which included people like Roy Grounds and Robin Boyd in Melbourne. And you can see Roy Grounds' beautiful house in Torbreck pictured. And also architects like Eddie Hayes and Campbell Scott in Brisbane. And this is one of their buildings. So modernist architects, like pretty much all architects in every era, wanted to make interesting shapes and to get famous. But unlike many other architectural movements, modernism was also ideologically motivated. Modernist architects and urban planners thought that they could improve the world. They were responding to a range of urban and socio-cultural challenges, including things like overcrowding, disease, poverty, a lack of basic amenities like running water and electricity. And architecture was seen as a way to bring modern rational ideas and pioneering technologies to bear on the social ills of humanity. And of course, to make cool shapes out of concrete. So what has become of these ideals? Where the driving force of the modernist movement had once been centred around political and social activism, we now seem, I believe, less optimistic about the capacity for architecture to change the world. Interest in modernism is still very strong, however, but the nature of our infatuation seems to have shifted. Nowadays, we see modernism as more of a style and a set of aesthetic properties. It's increasingly used as a marketing term to sell a particular aesthetic to a particular market, like real estate, furniture, or books and microblogs. So that's it with the scene setting. I'll come back to some of those themes a little bit later in the talk, but the bulk of what I wanted to speak about tonight is another renovation in Torbreck, and this time it's apartment 11G, which was once my home for a few years. Here's Torbreck as it was before the council planners showed how seriously they take their own protected view corridors. That's a nasty little joke that I hoped some people might get. All right. And this is a plan of the unit that we brought in the tower block. Everything in its right place, apart from a little DIY enclosure of the dining room to make a second bedroom out of a one-bedroom apartment. And you can see from these images that the base building was largely untouched, though the kitchen cabinetry had received a little too much TLC, including a Valentine's Day themed floor and a handy yellow shelf for bong storage. And this is a plan of the renovated unit. So the second bedroom has been removed, basically reverted back to its original condition, and there's a new set of walls that partially enclose the dining room, but apart from that, it's pretty much as you were. We raised the floor slightly to adjust the view out over the living room so that you would look over the furniture, not through it. And the new walls are subtly angled to mimic the displays of the tower block floor plate. We didn't want to treat the renovation as a restoration per se. Oh, we've got someone who needs the toilet. Now that one person has done it, if you are sitting on something and you want to make the dash, do it. We didn't want to treat the renovation as a restoration, but we did want to find an appropriate language for the new elements that complemented the original building. A sort of tweaking, something that might feel like it was a part of the original fabric, but that added something new. And around the time that I was designing the renovation, we were invited to give a couple of lectures in Tasmania, and a local architect took us to see Esmond Dorney's house in Hobart, which is a really special building if you ever get the chance to visit it. The visit reminded me that modernism has a language of geometric abstraction, and of texture and of pattern. You can see that in Torbreck, in particular in elements like the breeze block screens, the geometric tiles and the garden block, and the articulated brickwork and blue louvers on the sides of the building. So I started developing a set of details in the cabinetry in particular that borrowed from what I had observed in the modernist tradition. And after about 1.5 years of weekend work and waiting on tradespeople, we started settling in. And I have to say that it was pretty lovely and perhaps a little surreal to get to live in a place as special as Torbreck. I even had time to design a custom door plate. And as you can probably anticipate, life was obviously too easy. So we turned up the difficulty setting and tried to make 3 people fit into a 1-bedroom apartment. And just to clarify, we had 1 baby, not 5. And as a result, it was time to bid farewell to Torbreck and to start the story all over again. So I'm going to conclude with some closing thoughts that we might expand upon if we get time at the end, although when 3 architects are invited to speak, typically we are going to go over by about 3 times our original allotment, which we are managing to do. So it's easy, I think, to criticise modernism for its hubris, its paternalism, and ultimately for its capitulation to capitalism, if that's your bent. Modernists thought that they could erase existing fabric of entire communities and remake society in an idealised form through rational planning and radical new architecture. And I think they took for granted the intricate web of familial ties and social relationships that had sustained urban communities for centuries. And they failed to recognise the deep emotional connections that had developed between people and the places that they live. Time, I think, has demonstrated that it wasn't necessary to bulldoze entire inner-city neighbourhoods. One could argue that proper healthcare, sanitation and stable employment would probably have done the trick. But thankfully, that's only part of the story, because modernism has left us with an incredible legacy of architectural achievement, some of the most extraordinary and humane spaces that I've had the great fortune to visit and on occasion to inhabit as well, including Singapore's own Torbreck, the Pearl Bank Apartments, which I lived in for 12 months when I was in Singapore, which is the image on the right-hand side there with this extraordinary set of cantilevered stairs that project you out into the void of this 35-storey horseshoe-shaped plan, which sadly now has been demolished, which is actually a real tragedy because it was an extraordinary building. But to return to Torbreck, I think it's one of the success stories. I loved living there, and while Torbreck's more utopian ambitions failed, it didn't become a self-sustaining miniature city with a market hall, for example. And there are certainly parts of the building that aren't great, like the tower circulation lobbies, for example. But there's still so many aspects of the building that I think we can admire and celebrate. For example, apartments that receive light and air from at least 2 sides, which stands in stark contrast to many of the apartments that some of my colleagues in Melbourne have told me that they're building, which contain bedrooms which receive light and air from no sides, which is a little unfortunate, I think. And also, of course, the generous communal garden that Susan spoke about earlier that feels like a park, and I think rather poignantly is not over-designed like a cheap resort. And the building is beautiful, which is probably why so many architects and fans of modern design have lived there. Living in Torbreck feels a little different, a little less transient and a little less transactional. I think you can argue that the remarkable styling of the building plus a healthy dose of substantive design intelligence both contribute to making Torbreck a great place to live. It makes me wonder about the homes that we're building now and what they say about us and our collective values. And it makes me wonder what a city of Torbrecks might be like. Would they make great streets and great neighbourhoods? I think that's a question worth asking as we contemplate the future of our city. Thanks, that's me.
I just want to thank our speakers again for your rich and personal reflections on Torbreck and delving into these themes of sustainability, heritage, authorship and densification. I think we only have time for one or two questions. Does anyone have any questions? Jared?
Thank you, Lydia. I think I imagine sort of most people in the room sort of recognise Torbreck and sort of admire the building. But I think it's sort of interesting to reflect upon. In Brisbane, we're currently demolishing sort of countless houses from that period. What lessons do you think we can sort of take from Torbreck to sort of apply to how we think about kind of houses from that era, sort of what might be sort of something you might sort of encourage audience members to sort of think about when they're thinking about their own house or talking to friends or family who are contemplating knocking down their 1960s house with asbestos. Should we be doing more to protect those houses?
Just very briefly from me, I mean, we just simply can't go on knocking things down. We need to build with a long-term outlook moving forward, and we also need to find ways to reuse and reoccupy the buildings that we already have. I'm
not sure if this is what you meant, Jared, but I would add that a lot of domestic construction from that period was good solid brick and is actually better thermally in Brisbane than the earlier forms of timber housing. So there's lots of good reasons to keep the fabric for energy saving reasons, and that also translates into financial saving reasons, I think, as well, which are good ways to make arguments to people.
I think it's probably a bit of a policy thing that you were touching on with your talk. I live in Maruka, and there's lots of like 60s, 70s brick houses. Now there's kind of like brick box houses. I'm worried. Yeah. Look, and I didn't think when I purchased in the suburb that it doesn't have any kind of character overlay. So what's happening is that all the houses are getting knocked over and they're getting kind of like Hamptons McMansion-y things built on them, and the sites are sloping. They don't suit flat one-level project homes. But it's sad that you have to rely on a character code overlay from council to have any kind of meaningful, sustainable approach to housing and adaptive reuse. And it really needs to come from council that you need to be responsible for what you're demolishing, because these brick houses, they get knocked over in one day. And I watch what goes away and none of it gets sorted out. There's no masonry, timber, there's no attempt to recycle anything. It's very frustrating.
I'm really interested in, Aaron, in particular, what a postmodern form of mass social urbanism might look like in Brisbane, and whether the tower type is something that you've been thinking about or you could imagine, and if so, what the ingredients might be.
I wouldn't say I have a perfect answer to that question. I don't see any reason why multiple forms of high density living couldn't work in Brisbane. I think the lesson of Torbreck is that we have at least one tower that I think works quite effectively, provided that some of the key elements and lessons that can be taken from Torbreck are incorporated into that model. You could imagine that if that was replicated in Brisbane, given the mentality of the way in which the city is being developed, that one of the first things that would go would be the expansive, unprogrammed, beautiful open garden space that the entire building heavily relies on. Would probably fall off the developer's spreadsheet. And I think also when I was reflecting on the question that I asked at the end of my presentation about what would a city of Torbreck look like, I started thinking about the reasons why Torbreck is special and wondering whether part of the reason why it has succeeded is that it is unique within this city. So it attracts a particular community of people to it who I think maintain and sustain a really interesting and vibrant culture within the building. And if you were to replicate Torbreck around Brisbane, it would, by definition, not be unique in the way that it is now. And I wonder if that was the case, whether maybe some of the flaws of the building might start to come to the fore rather. So I probably haven't answered your question very well, Paddy, but I think it's one of the most important questions that Brisbane needs to confront, because at the moment what we appear to be doing is taking low-lying floodable areas that used to be used for light industrial and cramming really badly designed apartments onto them, making no provision for public transport or public parkland or even public schools, as you can see all the way along Montague Road here in West End. And we're very defiantly clinging to the idea that we're going to retain our timber and tin heritage, but only in the most empty and facile way possible, which is to say we'll keep the sort of general aesthetic of the original facades, but everything else is up for grabs. So rather than keeping, again, the important elements of the timber houses, like their street-facing verandas or their large open unprogrammed backyards, we're tripling and quadrupling the size of them, cramming them full of horrible rooms, filling in backyards, and achieving no tangible outcome in terms of the social density of the city. So we're losing open space, but not making a more urbane place for people to live. So we're kind of stuck. Like we have to bite the bullet, I think, and at some point decide whether we're going to be a low-density garden city and actually commit to that and protect it in a meaningful way, or we need to transition into something that looks towards the future, which might be something like Torbreck or a kind of medium-density model, probably ideally, from my perspective. Would anyone else like to? Susan?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. I mean, it's an excellent question. The reality is we are building postmodern, high-density high-rises all over the place, and they're not great quality. So I think we do have to grapple with that question. But the thing I wanted to add was something that's come across my eyes recently, which I think is really interesting, which is, again, going back to Leah's point too about the role of zoning and council regulation in the improving quality of housing, and that's something that Abby Galvin has been doing in New South Wales, the New South Wales Government Architect, which is about introducing a concept of micro-zoning, which is really trying to be much more sophisticated in the way that we mix densities in a city. And I think that's really an interesting way forward, and there's lots of potential for that in Brisbane. But it comes with its own challenges. So a lot of the medium density propositions that might get up from a design point of view, like in terms of good site opportunities, being able to develop medium density designs that would have really good amenity, are often not financially viable. So there's a kind of barrier there. And the point about microzoning is to smooth the path for approvals through council for those kinds of developments, which is one step in the right direction, but it's not the only thing that needs to happen to change the mix of densities that we can offer in a city as a city grows. And I do think Torbreck is interesting from that perspective in that it did have a diversity at its heart, and I think there's not one answer to the problems that we're facing, and that we do need to look at moving past the exceptionalism of the good, well-designed high-rise, which is maybe what we've talked about tonight with Torbreck, and see how that can be integrated in a higher quality way than happens with a lot of development, for example, on Montague Road that Aaron was just talking about, but also look at the way we might mix densities in a more sophisticated way. But I think that means more specific and bespoke responses and more individualised decision-making, and there are a lot of governance and bureaucratic barriers and financial barriers to that.
Does anyone else have any questions? Might take one more.
My question is for the whole panel. Torbreck's 65 years old now. It's really well maintained and well looked after, but does it have a life expectancy? And secondly, what are some of the advantages the garden block has over the tower block?
No vested interest here.
I'll start. I read a paper recently which was titled "Concrete is 100 years old," or something like that, which was really about making the point that reinforced concrete, which is this kind of fabulous modernist material that enabled all of these utopian visions and the high-rise, high-density living that we're talking about, has a lifespan, right? So the steel reinforcing in concrete carbonises over time, and the kind of scientific research around that suggests that 100 years is about what you can expect without some kind of intervention. So yeah, maybe there is a lifespan that we need to start thinking about. I think a lot of the infrastructure of modern cities dating from about the 1930s, if we think about what was happening around the world with lots of government investment in post-depression construction, that's all now coming to the end of, or getting close to that 100-year lifespan, and it's failing. Lots of bridges in the US are facing that problem. So it is a real problem. I think maintenance is a really important part of that. And there's a lot of work that's been done about maintaining and conserving concrete as a modernist material. The Getty has done a really big project and developed lots of resources to equip us to do that. So yeah, but I do think, my philosophy about longevity is that you need to use it or you lose it, right? So maintaining things is also about using them. So living in them and loving them and adapting them is how they are sustained. As for the tower versus the garden, I can't come down on one side or the other. The garden block is fabulous for its cross ventilation. How about I just say that?
I think it's probably maybe modernising some of the fire safety in the building is probably something as time progresses that needs to happen. In other apartment buildings in Brisbane of a similar vintage, which may remain nameless, we have been involved in some of the structural maintenance that's occurred over time. And it's pretty intense what can happen just with the sag that you get in concrete. And that these buildings, this style of building when it was built was relatively new and the slabs weren't that thick. And we have been involved in things where you do sort of like carbon webbing around columns to give more support to the concrete, and we've worked on apartments where some of these thinner slabs have got sag points of like almost 100 mils, which is a lot. There are a lot of considerations to that, but I think you just have to stay on top of it and stay aware of it. And the body corporates really need to take or building companies, whatever the ownership structure is, need to take a really, what's the right word? Like, you need to understand that there is like it is a person's apartment, and just because they're doing a reno doesn't mean that you can go in there and, you know, take over the whole thing and put halts on everything. Like, it has to be reasonable, because we have had experiences where it hasn't been reasonable from my point of view.
Thanks everyone for your questions. To wrap up the evening, Sarah's just going to talk about some upcoming events for EmAGN.
So as we said at the start, EmAGN runs a whole host of events throughout the year. We've got a committee of about 25, I think, this year. Jared's nodding. Good. Thumbs up. So we host talks. Our Value Talk series is much like the talk that you've been to tonight. We cover a whole host of different topics in those. We also organise walking tours, factory visits, and the odd hands-on workshop as well. If you'd like to hear more about those, you can go to Instagram. We're on there as EmAGN_QLD, or our information is always posted on the Australian Institute of Architects website.
Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and I'd like to thank Brisbane Open House for partnering with us. Thanks Anne and Rosie. Thanks for Vokes and Peters for hosting us in their studio. Our EmAGN committee for all your hard work behind the scenes, and a huge thank you, of course, to Leah, Susan and Aaron. Please accept these small gifts as tokens of our appreciation. Feel free to grab a drink and stick around. Carry on the conversation. Thank you.